Have you ever noticed how often the history we're told is just the tip of the iceberg? Everyone talks about the pharaohs, the pyramids, and the grand temples, but almost no one remembers the men who truly made Egypt. It's curious and even a little unfair to think that without them, the empire's grandeur might never have existed. What if I told you that the secret to Egypt's unity lay not only in the strength of gods or kings, but also in the silent work of ordinary men, men who, rowing day and night, sustained the economy, religion, and even politics of one of the greatest civilizations in history? It seems counterintuitive, I know, but that's precisely the beauty of this discovery. Today, you'll dive into a different story. Slow, monotonous, almost boring, and that's exactly what will help you relax, disconnect from the fast pace of the present, and maybe even fall asleep. After all, sometimes what we need isn't more stimulation, but an invitation to slow down, and there's no better way to do that than sailing the calm waters of the Nile. Before we begin, I want to ask you one thing. Comment here where you're watching from and what time it is now. It'll be interesting to see where everyone is embarking on this journey with me. For the ancient Egyptians, the Nile wasn't just a river, it was like a beating heart, sending life throughout the land. Imagine waking up early, opening the door of a simple mud hut, and seeing, just ahead, that immense body of water, ever moved, the gentle sound of waves lapping against the shore, mingled with the distant songs of birds. For a peasant, a merchant, or even a priest, everything began there, on the banks of the Nile. Throughout the day, people would approach the river as if visiting an old friend. It was there that people gathered water to cook, fish for lunch, and of course set sail for other villages. It's curious to think that today we complain about city traffic, honking horns, engines, endless lines, but back then, traffic was on the river, and the traffic jams came from lined up boats loaded with goods. The scenery changes, but the routine of commuting has always been present. The sounds were different. Instead of engines, there was the dragging of ropes, pulling boats, the creaking of timber, and the breath of wind inflating sails. To many, this might sound tiresome, but to the Egyptians, it was everyday music. Can you imagine the smell? A mixture of fresh water, mud, fresh fish, and the sweat of men working under the scorching sun. It was a scent of survival, of life in motion. Now, if you think about it, the river was a kind of living highway. Unlike today's paved and motionless streets, the Nile was constantly changing, sometimes fuller, sometimes shallower. This forced each person to respect nature's rhythm. It's as if today we have to wait for the internet to work according to the mood of the wind. Sounds strange, doesn't it? But that was their normality. Interestingly, many travelers of the time saw the Nile not only as a means of transportation, but also as a link between worlds. The north and south of Egypt, so distant, became neighbors thanks to its waters. It's as if someone today were to say that the internet doesn't connect computers, but it connects hearts. This metaphor, if carried forward, would make perfect sense. The Nile connected destinations, people, and story, and as with any place where there's movement, there also arose the need for someone who mastered that art, the boatmen. They were like today's ride-hailing drivers, indispensable, discreet, and often invisible. But without them, nothing happened. Without them, Egypt couldn't breathe. This is precisely where the story becomes even more intriguing. Being a boatman in ancient Egypt wasn't just a profession, it was a calling. Imagine waking up before sunrise, your body still heavy from the previous day, and already hearing the other men preparing the ropes and adjusting the sails. The smell of damp wood and linen rope permeated the air, mixed with the sound of water lapping against the hull. These men not only transported goods, but also carried on their shoulders the responsibility of keeping the empire moving. The long journeys along the river required more than physical strength. They required patience, strategy, and a keen eye on the wind. Sailing wasn't as simple as rowing mindlessly. One had to anticipate changes in the current, choose the right moment to open the sail, and even calculate stops in villages. Today, it would be like planning a road trip, factoring in traffic, fuel, only in their case, the road breathed, changed, and even rebelled against the unwary. Boatmen became indispensable precisely because no one could replace their experience. Not just anyone could navigate a vessel laden with grain, stone blocks, or important people. There were real risks. One miscalculation, and the boat could run aground or capsize. And in a world without cargo insurance, that could spell the end of a boatman's reputation. Imagine the pressure. Today we complain about the boss being a pain in the ass. But back then the pressure came from the river and survival. Interestingly, for many travelers, these boatmen were almost invisible. They were always there, working, but rarely received the recognition they deserved. How many of us don't do the same with the drivers who take us by bus or subway every day? Few remember their names, but without these professionals, the city would simply grind to a halt. The same ingratitude was repeated in ancient Egypt, in the middle of the Nile, and then there was the resilience of the body. Hours under the sun, their skins scarred by the heat and the oars, their feet damp from so much contact with the water. The work molded these men into rugged figures, almost sculpted by light. But there was also pride, that silent feeling of knowing that without their own effort, nothing would happen, as if each stroke of the oar were a brick placed in the construction of Egypt. So, amidst sweat, wind, and water, these boatmen became more than just workers. They became pillars of an entire civilization. But to understand their greatness, you must also understand the boats they used, from fragile papyrus canoes to colossal wooden ships. In the beginning, boats were simple, almost improvised. Made of papyrus, these small, lightweight vessels seemed fragile, but they served their purpose very well. They were used for quick fishing trips, crossing from one bank to the other, and even carrying small loads of vegetables. Imagine today using a bicycle to run everyday errands, practical, inexpensive, and hassle-free. Such were the papyrus canoes, companions of a peaceful routine. Over time, however, the needs of the Egyptian people grew. Trade required transporting more goods. Further, and engineering had to keep pace. This is when wooden boats emerged, larger, more durable, and equipped to handle long distances. These ships were the ancient equivalent of a modern truck, capable of carrying tons of grain or blocks of stone, a silent but essential transformation that allowed the empire to flourish. These larger boats, in turn, also required more men. It was impossible to control a large vessel alone. The rowers organized themselves in rows, coordinating their movements as if they were part of a single body. It's interesting to think of it as an orchestra. Each had their role, and if one missed the rhythm, everyone was affected. Harmony wasn't just desired, it was a matter of survival. Wooden boats also became the stage for encounter. Merchants from different villages, priests carrying offerings, even nobles crossing the river on official trips. Within the same boat, stories and destinies. Today, we might compare it to the atmosphere of an airplane. Strangers sharing the same space, each with their own luggage, but all dependent on the same pilot. In Egypt, this pilot was the boatman, and there was another curious difference. While papyrus canoes were disposable and short-lived, wooden boats were almost monumental constructions. They required investment, skilled labor, and constant maintenance. They were as if they were heirlooms, passed down from generation to generation. Each boat carried not only goods but also the history of a family, a community. The contrast between the fragile papyrus and the imposing wood showed how Egypt adapted to its own ambitions. From simple daily transport to grandiose expeditions, the river offered space for everyone. But it wasn't just the size of the vessels that mattered, it was also their efficiency, because traveling the Nile was always faster and more practical than navigating the desert roads. Anyone who has crossed a desert knows the landscape is beautiful, but unforgiving. Sand stretches as far as the eye can see, heat burns the skin, there's no shade, and there's a shortage of water. In ancient Egypt, attempting to transport goods by land was practically a sentence of failure. Roads, when they existed, were narrow, rugged, and unsafe. Therefore, the river became not only the best option, but practically the only reliable form of travel. While in the desert, caravans needed days or even weeks to travel relatively short distances, on the Nile, travel flowed more quickly. The current helped those heading north, and the wind favored those heading south. It was as if nature had offered Egypt a free highway, requiring only respect and knowledge. Today, we would call this a natural shortcut, like having a subway line right outside your door. The contrast was stark. On one side, exhausted men and animals carrying heavy burdens in the scorching desert heat. On the other, boats gliding smoothly, their cargo protected, their boatmen enjoying the breeze. Imagine a merchant back then. Which route would you choose to transport your goods, taking fewer risks and saving energy? The answer seemed obvious. The Nile was the ally of all those seeking efficiency. This dominance of river transportation also shaped the economy. Villages near the river prospered, while those further away struggled to grow. It was almost like the difference between modern cities crisscrossed by grand avenues and others isolated on dirt roads. Access changes everything: opportunities, commerce. The Nile, in this sense, was not just a river, but an accelerator of development. Even the daily lives of ordinary people depended on this logic. If someone needed olive oil, flax, or grain, they were unlikely to make a long journey through the desert to get it. They simply waited for the boats to dock, bringing new goods and supplies. It's like today when we wait for the delivery truck to pull up on the street, or for the app to notify us that the order is arriving. The difference is that in Egypt, this delivery was driven by the river current, and so the Nile gradually established itself as the true backbone of ancient Egypt. But simply trusting in nature wasn't enough. Boatmen knew the current could be both helpful and deceptive. That's why, alongside the river's power, another essential ally entered the picture: the sail, an inseparable companion in the fight against the current. The Nile had a curious secret. It flowed from south to north, defying the logic of most rivers we know. For the Egyptians, this was almost a blessing, because the current made downhill travel easier. Imagine boarding a boat loaded with grain and letting the force of the water do half the work for you. It was like riding a bicycle uphill without having to pedal so much. The river guided, and the boatman only had to maintain direction. But on the way back, the story changed completely. Traveling up the Nile required more ingenuity, because rowing against the current would be unbearable. That's when the sail became indispensable. The wind, which almost always blew southward, served as an ally. By unfurling the sail, the boat gained momentum, cutting through the water with dignity. This combination of current and wind was so perfect,
It seemed planned by the gods, balancing effort and reward. The curious thing is that this balance also taught a life lesson. There were days when the current helped, others when the wind saved. It was as if the river itself reminded the boatmen that one cannot depend on a single force. Today, we could apply this idea to our work, relying not only on talent, but also on discipline, not only on luck, but also on preparation. The secret was balance for the boatmen. Feeling the wind filling the sail was almost magical. The fabric stretched, the rope snapped, and the boat surged against the current as if it had grown wings. There was, of course, the risk of treacherous winds, but this was the daily adventure.
Think of the feeling of driving a car with a tailwind on the highway. The engine responds better, fuel consumption decreases, and the journey feels lighter. But that's how it was on the Nile, only with water and silence instead of asphalt and horns. And there was also a symbolic side to this dynamic. The river taught us that life wasn't all about easy descents. For every smooth trip north, there was a challenging climb south. The boatmen learned to navigate this cycle, and perhaps that's why they were so respected in their role. They knew how to harness the river's help while still preparing for obstacles. This silent, practical wisdom transformed each journey into a metaphor for endurance and adaptation. And while the current and wind dictated the pace, the boatmen had to be ever vigilant, because each season brought change. The Nile's floods and droughts completely altered the landscape, and only the most experienced knew how to navigate without falling into traps. The Nile's floods were awaited like a spectacle of nature. The water overflowed, flooding the banks and leaving behind fertile soil, essential for agriculture. But for the boatmen, it wasn't just beauty, it was also a challenge. The river became unpredictable, creating new channels and hiding treacherous rocks. Navigating in these conditions required keen eyes, almost like seeing with your skin, feeling every shift in the current. During dry periods, the opposite happened. The river level dropped, the channels narrowed, and many stretches became too shallow for large boats. The boatmen had to be extra patient, searching for safe passages, and often getting out to push the boat. It was exhausting work, as if today you had to push a car because the road simply disappeared. The Nile tested the resilience of those who lived on it. Accumulated experience made all the difference. There were boatmen who knew by heart where the river usually opened new branches or closed old passages. They were like living maps, carrying the secrets of the waters in their memory. This knowledge was passed down from father to son, almost like a sacred inheritance. Imagine the privilege of being born, learning from a young age to decipher the behavior of an entire river. With each season, the river seemed to tell a new story, sometimes generous, sometimes relentless, sometimes easy to cross, sometimes treacherous. It's curious how life works this way too. Periods of abundance, when everything flows, and dry spells when you have to row harder. Knowing how to recognize each cycle and adapt to it was the true wisdom of the boatman. Today it would be no different. When the going gets tough, we adapt. When there's plenty, we take advantage. The sounds also changed with the season. During high water, the roar of the water was intense, almost deafening, drowning out even the men's voices. During low water, an uncomfortable silence reigned, broken only by the creaking of ropes or the strain of oars. For those who lived off it, each sound was a clue, a warning that the river was changing its mood. It was necessary to listen to survive, and so, sailing through floods and droughts, the boatmen learned that life is never stable. The Nile was both teacher and adversary, showing that only the attentive prospered. But mastering the water wasn't enough.
It was also necessary to know what to transport: grains, stones, fabrics. Each cargo had its value, and this completely changed the responsibility of a voyage. The boatman wasn't just handling water, but also the weight of the riches he carried. Imagine a boat crammed with grain, each sack representing the sustenance of entire families. The sweet, dry smell of freshly harvested wheat mingled with the wood of the boat and the sweat of the men. It was like transporting life in its raw form, the food that would ensure the people would never go hungry throughout the year. Linen, in turn, had a different value, delicate and soft. It was a fabric that clothed everyone from peasants to pharaohs. Transporting it required care, because even a careless approach to the water could ruin the entire ship. The boatmen knew they were carrying not just bolts of fabric, but the result of months of work by weavers and farmers. Today, it would be like loading a fragile package into the trunk, knowing that if it breaks, there will be no replacement. And then there was the monumental challenge of transporting stones. Limestone blocks, as heavy as mountains, were transported in reinforced boats. The scene was impressive, dozens of men rowing in unison, the boat creaking under the colossal weight, and the boatmen steering everything with precision. It was as if each journey were a piece of a pyramid in motion. Without them, those structures we now call marvels simply wouldn't exist. The contrast between such different cargoes was curious. One day, the boat carried baskets of light grain, swaying in the wind. The next, stones that seemed to defy the logic of buoyancy. This required admirable versatility from the boatman, like a driver who can handle both a small car and a huge truck. It wasn't just strength, it was intelligence applied to transportation. These shipments had not only economic value, but also spiritual value. When the boats carried stones to temples, the boatmen felt they were participating in something greater, almost divine. It was as if their hands were helping to erect monuments destined for eternity. A sense of quiet pride, difficult to put into words, but present with every stroke of the oar. And amidst grains, fabrics, and stones, the Nile became the scene of constant movement. The coming and going of vessels was so vital that the river seemed never to rest. But the cargo wasn't limited to material things. Often people embarked on these voyages, and this brought even more interesting stories. Nile boats weren't just for goods, they often also served as transportation for ordinary people, needing to cross from one bank to the other to visit relatives, trade at fairs, or simply participate in rituals. Imagine the scene. Entire families boarding, curious children gazing at the water, mothers carrying baskets, elderly people leaning on staffs. The boat became a living portrait of society. Priests were also frequent passengers, dressed in white linen robes. They carried offerings and sacred objects, or accompanied processions. For the boatmen, transporting them was a sign of respect. After all, these men held influence not only on the land, but also on religious imagery. It was like today's giving a ride to someone highly respected in the community, whose presence changes the behavior of everyone around them. The merchants, meanwhile, filled the boats with conversations and exchanges of information. They discussed prices, harvests, and the most profitable. For them, each trip was also an opportunity to close deals or expand contacts. The boatman, even in silence, ended up listening to everything. He was like a modern taxi driver who throughout the day listens to stories from different passengers and becomes the guardian of the city's secrets. And of course, there were the Egyptian authorities. When an official, a scribe, or even someone close to the pharaoh boarded, the atmosphere changed. The boat had to be impeccable, movements were calculated, and respect was absolute. The river became the stage for a silent parade in which every detail was observed. It was almost like today's official procession cruising the streets with escorts and gleaming black chariots. This mix of passengers made each voyage on the same boat. A simple peasant and a priest, a talkative merchant and a serious official could be side by side. The Nile leveled everyone on the vessel. Everyone depended equally on the boatmen. It was a curious coexistence, uniting different worlds in a single crossing. And it wasn't just day to day. On special occasions such as religious festivals or ceremonies, the boats took on even greater importance, carrying people and offerings. The river was bustling with activity, like a grand avenue on a day of celebration. But there was a special detail. On these occasions, even the boats received extra attention and were often decorated in surprising ways. During major religious festivals, the Nile became a vibrant stage of movement and devotion. Boats carried not only common goods, but also offerings to the gods. Baskets filled with fruit, jars of wine, sacks of grain, and even fragrant flowers filled the vessels. Imagine the contrast. A river once so important in daily life, now overrun by boats that resembled floating processions. The boatmen then assumed a special role. They were not just workers, but carriers of something sacred. Each stroke of the oar carried symbolic weight, as if human effort were part of the offering. It's a silence, broken only by the sound of water against the hulls, mingled with the distant chanting coming from the temples. It was like attending a solemn mass, but on the water. These journeys required extra care. After all, an offering couldn't get lost or damaged along the way. The boatmen knew they were transporting not just objects, but the intentions, promises, and hopes of an entire people. If a vessel fell into the water, it wasn't just a material loss. It was almost a bad sign, an unintentional offense to the gods. The silent responsibility was part of the job. It's curious to think that in these moments, the boats became an extension of the temple. The sacred was not only present in the stone altar, but also in the banks, in the ropes, in the oars, and in the calloused hands of the boatmen. The river was the corridor that connected the people to the divine. Today, we can compare it to modern religious processions, in which entire streets become extensions of churches, filled with music, faith, and hope. And then there was the festive side. During the celebrations, the scent of incense wafted through the air, mingling with the food prepared for the banquets. The colorful flowers adorned the boats, and even the sounds of the river seemed to harmonize with the chant. For those who lived in that era, witnessing this scene was a rare blend of faith and beauty, where the ordinary became extraordinary. But not all boats stood out for their decoration. Some were simple, functional, and understated, used only to transport essentials. This difference revealed something important. Even the vessels bore the mark of the occasion, and on many of them, the decorations, or lack thereof, told stories about the purpose of each voyage. In everyday life, the boats that plied the Nile were simple, practical, and raw wood, worn ropes, sails stained by sun and dust. No ornaments, no flashy colors. After all, their purpose was one: to transport people and goods efficiently. It was like a popular car used for work, without luxurious accessories, but which never fails to fulfill its purpose. On special occasions, the scene changed completely. For religious ceremonies, festivals, or funeral processions, the vessels were decorated with intricate details. The sails were dyed, the sides painted, and sometimes even flowers were tied to the sides. These boats weren't just means of transportation, they were symbols of devotion and status. Imagine a modern parade, with floats passing through the streets. In Egypt, the spectacle took place on the water. The details went far beyond aesthetics. A decorated boat also conveyed a silent message. It said, "Here comes something important, worthy of gods or kings." The ornaments communicated reverence and grandeur, transforming each vessel into a floating temple. The boatmen, in turn, felt part of this ritual. Like guardians of the sacred, it was a responsibility but also an honor. This difference between ordinary boats and ceremonial vessels reminds us of the contrast that still exists today. Think of a simple bus, which transports workers daily, and compare it to a limousine used at weddings or gala events.
Both fill the same basic function, getting people from one place to another, but the way they present themselves completely changes the experience. The same was true on the Nile. There was a curious detail. Many boatmen were proud to at least once in their lives sail a ceremonial vessel. It was almost like receiving an invisible medal, a silent recognition, even if they later returned to the hard work of carrying stones or grain. They kept in their memory that special moment when the boat they sailed was more than a boat. It was a floating altar. This transition between the ordinary and the extraordinary made the Nile even more fascinating. But for everything to work, it was essential that the boatmen know every bend in the river, every stretch of water, every safe crossing point. Because it wasn't enough to have beautiful boats, they had to know where and how to navigate. Being a boatman in ancient Egypt wasn't just about rowing and moving forward, it was about carrying within your mind a veritable living map of the Nile. Every channel, every branch of the river, every bend hid secrets that only experience could reveal. There were treacherous stretches full of submerged rocks, others too shallow for larger boats, and still others that changed according to the flood. Navigating without knowing these details would be like driving in a city without signs or GPS. Learning came with age. Many boys began following their parents from an early age, observing every gesture, every route choice, and memorizing natural landmarks. Isolated trees, rock formations, even the sound of water lapping in certain places served as guide. It was almost as if the river spoke its own language, and the boatmen became interpreters. This skill wasn't taught in books, it was passed down by word of mouth, from generation to generation. Knowing the safest crossing points was vital. Ordinary people depended on these boatmen to reach markets, temples, and other villages. A wrong choice could cost lives or precious goods. Imagine a merchant with his entire linen production relying on the judgment of a boatman. The entire year's prosperity could depend on a split-second decision. It was a silent but constant responsibility. It's interesting to compare this with modern life. Today, ride-hailing drivers rely on GPS, but they still need to know shortcuts, dangerous streets, and heavy traffic times. The difference is that in Egypt, there was no technology, only trained instinct and observation. This reliance on human knowledge made the boatmen almost indispensable, someone in whom more than physical safety was placed. Trust in one's own future. Sounds and smells also aided navigation. The rustling of leaves indicated proximity to dense vegetation. The strong smell of mud betrayed shallow areas, and even the presence of birds could indicate abundant fish, and therefore deeper water. It was a sensory dive in which boatmen used not just their eyes but all their senses to guide their boats. And so, with knowledge, patience, and instinct, they transformed the Nile into a navigable and reliable route. But for this system to work, it wasn't enough to simply know where to sail. They also needed support points along the journey. Entire villages sprang up as makeshift ports, supporting the comings and goings of vessels. Along the banks of the Nile, it was not uncommon to find villages that depended on the river. There, small, makeshift ports sprang up, simple mud ramps, reinforced with stones, or boats docked to load or unload goods. There were no luxurious buildings or well-planned wooden docks. These were rustic but functional spaces that ensured the movement of grain, textiles, and even people. These makeshift ports were the beating heart of the village. Early in the morning, there was already a flurry of activity. Peasants carrying heavy sacks on their backs, women balancing water jugs on their heads, children running curiously around the boats. The noise was constant. Loud voices, beating oars, animals pulling carts. The smell of fresh fish mingled with that of human sweat and dust heated by the sun. It was chaotic, yet full of life. Each village had its own rhythm, and the ports reflected this. Some were busier, receiving boats daily, while others only saw activity at certain times of the year, during harvests. For traders, knowing these points was essential, because they were where rapid exchanges took place, intense negotiations, and often the best profits were made. They were like little subway stations scattered along the river. These places also served as meeting points. News arrived by boat, travelers brought stories of distant places, and even political information circulated through conversations at the... Imagine living in an isolated village and suddenly learning of changes in the royal palace because a boatman brought the news. It was a primitive but effective way of keeping society connected. The boatmen, in turn, depended on these support points. It was there that they rested, obtained food, and even repaired their vessels. They often formed bonds with local families, being treated almost as members of the community. A makeshift port was not only a place of work, but also a space for social interaction, where relationships were built that went beyond trade. And as trade expanded, these small ports gained strategic importance. They connected smaller villages to large cities and temples. But it didn't stop there. These same ports were also gateways to something even greater: the integration of Upper and Lower Egypt. Ancient Egypt was divided into two major regions: Upper Egypt in the south and Lower Egypt in the north, near the delta. Despite geographic, cultural, and even political differences at times, there was something that united these territories: trade along the Nile. And at the heart of this mechanism were the boat. They were the silent messengers who carried riches from one side to the other, ensuring that the empire functioned as a single entity. In Upper Egypt, agricultural products such as cereals and flax were abundant. Lower Egypt, closer to the Mediterranean, benefited from external trade, offering spices and rare objects. Boatmen bridged these two realities, connecting different needs. They were as if they were truckers on an invisible highway, carrying and bringing what sustained the economy's balance. Each voyage represented more than transportation. It was cultural integration, sailing from south to north. The boatmen carried not only goods but also accents, stories, and traditions. Imagine someone hearing new music or learning different recipes simply because a boat brought them. The Nile carried not only goods, but also identities that gradually merged. Trade also brought challenges. In times of political instability, crossing the two regions could be risky, but the boatman, with his practical neutrality, was often seen as a trustworthy figure. He represented not a pharaoh or a temple, but everyday survival. He was the discreet link no one could do without. This strategic position placed them in a position of respect, though rarely officially recognized. It's curious to note that even without realizing it, the boatmen were builders of Egypt's unity. Without them, Upper and Lower Egypt might have remained separate, disconnected worlds. The river was already the natural highway, but it only made sense because there were people who knew how to navigate boats from one end to the other. It was like having a huge bridge with no one to cross it. And of course, This trade wasn't limited to domestic goods. Foreign merchants often arrived, bringing news from distant lands, and guess who served as the link between them and the Egyptians? Always the boatmen, who became not only transporters but also mediators between worlds. When foreign merchants arrived in Egypt, the Nile was their gateway. They came from distant lands, bringing spices, precious stones, rare woods, and even exotic animals. But there was one catch. To navigate the river, they needed someone who knew every bend, every current, every risky spot. And that's where the Egyptian boatmen came in, hired as indispensable guides. Without them, these merchants wouldn't have gotten far. These voyages were unique opportunities for the boat. Working with foreigners, they gained access to products they would never see in everyday life. Strong perfumes, colorful fabrics, gleaming bronze objects. Imagine the impact on a man accustomed to carrying grain and stones to see such diverse goods before him. It was like opening a window to another world, even if only for a moment. The merchants, in turn, valued this partnership. They knew that a mistake in the route could cost the entire voyage. They trusted the boatmen not only as navigators, but also as protectors, capable of preventing strandings or attacks. This relationship was almost symbiotic. On one side, the foreigner with wealth and novelties. On the other, the Egyptian with knowledge and experience. Together, they transformed the Nile into an international thoroughfare. Interestingly, many boatmen treasured stories from these voyages. They told their children about the foreigners with strange languages, unusual clothes, and curious habits. These stories were passed down from generation to generation, fueling the imagination of those who had never left their own village. It was a way to travel the world without leaving the Nile. This contact also generated learning. Many boatmen observed navigation techniques used by foreigners, compared vessels, and learned new ways of organizing cargo. It was a silent exchange, but one that gradually enriched local knowledge. The Nile, more than a river, was a school in constant movement. But not all was harmony. Where there was trade and money, there were also disputes, and the boatmen, in the midst of this flow, often found themselves embroiled in tensions over tariffs and negotiations. The boatmen's work didn't always run smoothly. After all, where there's commerce, there's also price bickering. Many boatmen charged different rates depending on the cargo, the number of passengers, or even the season. During harvest times, when demand was higher, prices rose. This generated grumbling and discontent among merchants and farmers. It was like complaining about the price of a ride on an app when surge pricing skyrockets. These disputes were not only economic, but also social. Some accused the boatmen of taking advantage of the people's needs, while others argued that their work was too hard and risky to be poorly paid. The result, tensions spilled over into the villages, especially at the ports, where negotiations took place. The Nile, which united people, could also be the scene of heated arguments. It's interesting to consider how these tensions reflect something timeless. Today, we question bank rates, taxes, or essential services. But the essence is the same, the perception that someone is profiting more than they should. In Egypt, this translated into the boatmen. Today, it translates into institutions that seem to always be rowing against us. The dilemma hasn't changed, only the protagonists. The boatmen, for their part, knew how to defend themselves. Many argued that their boats required constant maintenance, that rowers had to be paid, and that the risk of running aground or losing cargo was always real. Charging more was, in part, a way to protect themselves from unforeseen circumstances. And let's face it, there was logic to this. No one likes to work hard without the guarantee of a fair reward. These discussions also revealed inequality.
Wealthier merchants could pay without complaint, but poor peasants felt the brunt of the tariffs. This power gap created silent friction, as if the river were a mirror of society itself. Some could navigate with ease, while others struggled to board, and in the midst of this, the boatmen were seen sometimes as heroes, sometimes as villains. But despite the tensions, the wheel of trade never stopped. Boats continued to travel up and down the Nile, and boatmen continued to charge for their work. What changed was their reputations. Some were known as fair, others as greedy, and this reputation spread quickly through the villages, creating stories that spanned generations. During peak periods on the Nile, bountiful harvests, religious festivals, or major construction projects underway, demand for boats soared, and as in any market, the laws of supply and demand came into play. Many boatmen seized the opportunity to raise their rates, justifying the extra effort and risk of carrying more cargo or more people. It was like today when hotels double their prices during holidays or ride-hailing apps activate dynamic pricing. This behavior, however, generated mixed reactions. Some accepted it as a natural part of trade. After all, everyone wanted a piece of the profit, but others saw it as exploitation, accusing the boatmen of taking advantage of others' needs. In the villages, it was not uncommon to hear stories of heated arguments at the ports, with merchants gesticulating and boatmen firmly defending their prices. The river in these moments seemed more like a noisy marketplace than a peaceful thoroughfare. It's curious how this repeats itself today. Think of concert tickets that sold out in minutes and resold for absurd prices, or the time when masks and hand sanitizer became rare, and some people drastically increased their prices. The essence is the same. When demand is high and supply is limited, there will always be those who see a chance to make more. The Egyptian boatman, in this sense, was not so different from the modern merchant. For some boatmen, charging more wasn't about greed, but survival. Raising the price meant securing boat repairs, supporting their families, or simply compensating for days when the river was impassable. It was a way to find balance, albeit an unpopular one. But as we know, the line between legitimate need and abuse is always thin, and for those who pay, the feeling of injustice often speaks louder. There was also a reputational dimension. A boatman known for charging a high price might even make a profit in certain seasons, but risked losing customers in normal times. Therefore, many needed to think strategically. How high could they raise prices without compromising the village's trust? It was an invisible negotiation in which prestige was as valuable as silver. And even with all this interplay of interest, demand never diminished, because after all, no one could do without the boatmen. Without them, trade would come to a standstill, temples would lack offerings, and even the population's food supply would be compromised. Perhaps that's why these men were so respected. Even amid criticism, their importance was undeniable, and their strength lay not only in their fares, but also in their physical endurance, which kept them rowing for hours and hours. A boatman's body was forged by the river itself. Broad arms, strong shoulders, calloused hands bearing the memory of thousands of rowing strokes. From an early age, they learned to master rowing, not as an exercise, but as a natural extension of the body. It was common for them to spend uninterrupted hours in the repetitive motion of rowing, under the scorching sun, or in the early morning chill. The Nile brooked no weakness. It molded men as resilient as the limestone they carried. This endurance wasn't built overnight. It was the result of a tough routine, where rest was rare and effort was constant. Rowing required not only muscles, but also stamina and mental discipline. The boatman knew he couldn't afford to stop whenever he wanted. The boat only moved forward as long as his hands insisted on pushing the water. Imagine pedaling a stationary bike for hours today, without music, without distractions, just the repetitive sound of the gear. This was their reality. but on much larger scales. Interestingly, this physical strength was accompanied by impressive psychological endurance. Spending so much time in silence, listening only to the sound of the river and the master boatman's commands, required almost meditative patience. Some say the repeated rowing created a trance-like state in which the body worked alone and the mind wandered. It was, in a way, a spiritual exercise, albeit an unintentional one. And of course, there were the visible marked sunburned skin, the arched backs, the rigid muscles, all betrayed a life of exertion. These men didn't need gyms or elaborate training. The river itself was their school of endurance. Today, when we talk about high-performance athletes, we might imagine something similar. Bodies shaped by daily training, by a discipline that allows no one to give up. The boatmen were the marathoners of the Nile. This resilience made them respected, yet humble figures. People knew that not just anyone could handle such hard work, and even without medals or awards, there was a quiet admiration. Many young people looked up to them and dreamed of achieving the same strength and resilience, even if it meant a lifetime of hardship. But the boatmen's endurance wasn't limited to daytime. In exceptional circumstances, they also had to navigate the night, and then the challenge took on a new layer. Rowing by torchlight, guided by darkness and courage. Night on the Nile had a unique atmosphere. Silence reigned, interrupted only by the croaking of frogs and the distant sound of water lapping against the banks. Sailing in such conditions was rare, but when necessary, boatmen lit torches to illuminate the way. The flickering flame reflected on the river's surface created an almost magical scene, as if stars had descended from the sky to float above the water. These night crossings usually occurred in urgent situations, transporting officials in a hurry, carrying offerings that needed to reach the temple by dawn, or even moving supplies in times of crisis. The risk was obvious, as the darkness hid rocks, sandbars, and treacherous bends. But the boatmen trusted in the memory of the river, the sounds of the current, and the fragile light of torches. It was courage mixed with necessity. Imagine the contrast. During the day, the Nile throbbed with movement, boats crossing in all directions, voices, negotiation. At night, a solitary boat, lit only by small flames, cut through the silent waters. To those watching from afar, the scene must have seemed like an apparition, almost supernatural. Perhaps it's no wonder that many Egyptian myths linked the river, the night, and the physical challenge was also greater. Their bodies, tired after a full day of work, needed extra strength to row in the darkness. The early morning chill seeped into their bones, and their eyes strained to discern shadows. Still, the boatmen pressed on, knowing that certain tasks could not wait. It was like driving in the wee hours of the morning to deliver something important, tiring, dangerous, but inevitable. The torches, besides providing light, served as a warning. Anyone on the shore or in another boat could recognize the movement from a distance. It was a sign of life amidst the darkness.
The smell of smoke permeated the air, mingling with the humid aroma of the river. The scene, though challenging, also had its beauty, as if the Nile revealed a secret face, accessible only to the most fearless. And so, even in the darkest night, the boatmen kept Egypt moving. But darkness wasn't the only obstacle. The river's own changes during floods transformed the landscape and required even more expertise to prevent the boats from running aground or getting lost. The Nile's floods were awaited with anxiety and reverence. The river overflowed, fertilizing its banks and ensuring future harvests. But for the boatmen, this natural spectacle was fraught with challenges. With each flood, the The landscape changed as if redrawn by invisible hands. New channels appeared, sandbars disappeared, and previously visible rocks became submerged. Navigating without experience was like entering a constantly changing labyrinth. Veteran boatmen excelled at these moments. They recognized subtle signs, the sound of a stronger current in certain stretches, the movement of foam indicating shallow waters, even the flight of birds revealing where there was food and therefore safe water. Knowledge lay not in maps, but in the keen senses of those who had the river as their lifelong companion. It was as if the boatmen were a reader of invisible signs, deciphering messages hidden in nature. These floods created curious situation areas that were once dry land, turned into temporary lakes, and entire villages had to adapt. Imagine waking up and discovering that the only way to your home was by boat. For many Egyptians, this was an annual reality. And who made this adaptation possible? The boatmen who knew how to transform chaos into a navigable route. The risk of running aground was constant. A heavy boat, laden with grain or rocks, stuck on a sandbar could mean enormous damage and even threaten the lives of the crew. In these situations, patience was as important as strength. Rowing wasn't enough. You had to wait, observe, and calmly choose your direction. Today, it would be like driving on a flooded road, not knowing where the hidden potholes are. Haste could be fatal. With each flood, the boatmen gained even more respect. After all, only they had mastered the art of transforming an unpredictable river into a reliable highway. It was almost magical. Where others saw confusion, they saw paths. This silent mastery established them as guardians of the Nile, men who understood nature better than any scribe. And amidst floods and improvised routes, boatmen also played a delicate role. They carried not only goods or ordinary passengers, but also funerary vessels, carrying mummies and offerings towards eternity. Transporting goods was already a heavy task, but steering funeral vessels took on a completely different weight. It wasn't just about cargo, but a sacred ritual. The boatmen chosen for this role were specialized, men who carried not only oars, but also the responsibility of guiding souls to the afterlife. Every movement on the river carried spiritual significance, and the silence on board was profound, almost palpable. These funeral boats were different from ordinary ones. Decorated with religious symbols, they carried not only the mummified body of the deceased, but also offerings, food, ceramic vases, amulets, and even miniature furniture. It was as if everything necessary for the afterlife was transported along. For the boatmen, participating in this process was an honor, but also a burden of respect and awe. Imagine the scene. The boat gliding slowly down the Nile, sails raised, rowers silent, and the sound of the water keeping time. On the banks, people watched with reverence, knowing this was no ordinary voyage. It was like watching a modern funeral procession, but over the mirror of the water. The river became a bridge between two worlds, and the boatmen were the guides on this crossing. There were beliefs that the way the body was transported influenced the deceased's fate in the afterlife. Therefore, the boatman's skill was not only practical, but also spiritual. He had to ensure that nothing went wrong, that the crossing was dignified and serene. It was as if his role were part of the rite of passage itself, a link between the land of the living and the realm of the dead. These specialized boatmen ended up being viewed with a different aura. They weren't priests, but they carried something sacred within them. Many locals believed they had a closer connection to the gods or spirits. This perception, even if unofficial, made them figures of respect, sometimes even fear. After all, Those who deal with the sacred carry a mystery that inspires reverence. And it's interesting to note how this vision was reflected in Egyptian mythology. The god Ra himself was described traveling in a solar bark, crossing the heavens and the underworld every day. The work of the funerary boatmen seemed to echo this myth. Ordinary men, repeating on a human scale the divine crossing. And this brings us to a fascinating point: how boats, beyond practicality, also occupied a central place in the religious imagination of Egypt. In Egyptian mythology, the boat was not just a means of transportation, it was a symbol of something greater, almost eternal. The best known example is the solar bark of Ras, the sun god. Every day, it was believed he crossed the sky in his golden vessel, bringing the morning light, and at night the same bark plunged into the underworld, battling monsters and shadows until being reborn on the horizon. This narrative gave the boat a cosmic dimension, connecting everyday life to eternity. For the Nile boatmen, hearing these myths must have been a source of identification. After all, they too spent days sailing, facing risks and obstacles to ensure life went on. The difference is that Ra fought cosmic serpents, while they braved submerged rocks and rapids. Still, the sensation of steering a boat was almost divine, as if each oar stroke echoed the movement of the sun god. Interestingly, this image of the solar bark was not limited to Ra. Other gods such as Osiris and Isis were also associated with vessels in myths and rituals. The idea of crossing was central. A boat signified passage, transformation, and movement between worlds. It was not only physical transportation, but also spiritual. This explains why so many boats were buried alongside pharaohs, as if they were vehicles for eternity. This symbolism also influenced the common people. When they saw a funeral boat gliding down the river, many believed the scene was an earthly reproduction of Ra's journey through the afterlife. It was as if the sky, the river, and mythology met in the same landscape. Each vessel thus carried not only people and objects, but also ideas and beliefs. Today, we can draw interesting parallels. Consider how we use airplanes in modern stories to symbolize freedom, travel, or rebirth. For the Egyptians, this metaphor lay in the boat. It represented the ability to move between the known and the unknown, between life and death, between routine and the divine. The simple act of sailing thus became a way to participate in the myth. And interestingly, this connection between boats and spirituality wasn't limited to sacred texts. It also appears on the walls of temples and tombs, where boatmen were depicted in paintings, immortalized as essential figures in Egyptian life and religion. The walls of Egyptian tombs and temples are veritable stone books, and boatmen also find their place among them. In many mural paintings, we see men steering boats laden with goods, fishermen in small papyrus canoes, or even scenes of ceremonial crossings. These images were not created haphazardly. Each line had a purpose, and the fact that boatmen appear in them demonstrates the importance of their work in daily life and religious life. The details are striking. You can see the long oars, the taut ropes, the triangular sails, and even the expressions of effort on the men's faces. The scene is almost vivid, as if it were a documentary record of an essential activity. For the Egyptians, immortalizing boatmen on walls was a way of saying, without them, nothing works. Imagine someone today depicting bus drivers or truck drivers in murals. The comparison is apt because both are silent pillars of life and motion. These paintings also had symbolic value. By depicting boatmen on tombs, the idea was to ensure that the deceased would have transportation in the afterlife. The boat, once again, emerged as a symbol of crossing between worlds, and the men who navigated it gained a sacred role. Thus, even simple figures without noble titles could be remembered for millennia through art. It's curious to think that many of these boatmen never imagined that their faces or gestures would be preserved forever. They worked day after day, rowing under the scorching sun, never imagining that some scribe artist would record them on walls destined for eternity. It's as if a modern photographer decided to immortalize ordinary workers in a museum. This subtle appreciation shows how indispensable they were. These images also serve as historical sources. Today, scholars can better understand how vessels worked, navigation techniques, and even cargo types, thanks to these records. It's fascinating to realize that the daily lives of ordinary people became key to deciphering an entire civilization. And so, the boatmen were not only men of the present, but also characters of the future, left as a visual legacy, and their role went beyond transportation. They were part of the machinery that connected temples, cities, and agricultural fields, sustaining the grandeur of ancient Egypt. The Nile was much more than a river. It was an artery that nourished and united all of Egypt. The vessels that sailed up and down its waters connected sacred temples, bustling cities, and fertile agricultural fields. Imagine a nervous system in which each part of the body depends on communication with the rest. This is how Egypt worked. Without river transport, each region would be isolated, and the empire would not have the power we know today. Temples, for example, were supplied by boats, agricultural offerings, animals, wine, and even precious stones arrived via boatmen. Without them, religious ceremonies would lose their luster and power. Cities, in turn, received food and materials from the interior, ensuring full markets and well-nourished populations. The countryside produced, but it was the river that carried this produce to consumers. It's curious to think how this resembles modern life. Today, trucks crisscross highways to supply supermarkets, but in Egypt the process was even more harmonious, guided by current and wind. The Nile functioned as a natural highway, requiring no tolls or paving, just respect for its rules. The boatman, in this scenario, was the equivalent of the long-distance driver, essential but nearly invisible. This connection was not only economic but also political. The pharaoh was only able to maintain his authority because the Nile brought distant regions closer together. The message of royal power, orders, and even taxes traveled by boat. The river was therefore a tool of centralization, strengthening the empire and ensuring its fragmentation. The boatmen, without realizing it, worked as an ally of the pharaoh, even without wearing crowns or carrying scepters. Along the banks, each boat landing brought new life. The sound of oars echoed. Children ran to see the vessels. Merchants bustled to receive goods. It was a spectacle repeated daily, but one that shaped everyone's routine. With each completed voyage, a city prospered, a temple filled, a field found outlets for its produce. And when we think of great Egyptian enterprises such as trading expeditions to distant lands, we realize that this river network was just the beginning. Boatmen not only connected Egypt internally, but also paved the way for external contacts that would take civilization even further. Expeditions to distant lands were true events in the history of ancient Egypt. One of the most famous was the mythical land of Punt, a place of almost legendary riches from which came incense, ebony, ivory, and even exotic animals. For these voyages to take place, the presence of Nile navigators was essential, guiding the vessels to their departure ports and often participating in the long sea journey themselves. Preparation began long before departure. Larger boats were built, supplies carefully sorted, and crews hand-picked. Among those selected were always the most experienced boatmen who knew how to handle currents, winds, and unexpected events. They were, in a sense, the practical engineers, transforming grandiose plans into reality on the waters. Without them, expeditions would be nothing more than intentions written on papyrus. During these voyages, the boatmen encountered different cultures, strange languages, and never-before-seen goods. Imagine the surprise of a man accustomed to transporting wheat and stones to encounter aromatic myrrh, exotic monkeys, or rare woods emitting intense perfume. It was like opening a portal to another world, and the experience certainly left a deep impression on them. Arrival in foreign lands was always celebrated with caution and curiosity. While the merchants negotiated, the boatmen tended the vessels, ensuring they were ready for the return journey. They knew that the real challenge was not just arriving, but returning safely, bringing the riches they had conquered intact. It was like a round-trip mission, where every detail could mean the difference between success and disaster. These expeditions were also symbols of political prestige. When a pharaoh sent ships to Punt and they returned laden with treasure, his authority was reinforced in the eyes of the people. But deep down, behind the glory attributed to the sovereign, were the anonymous boatmen who rowed, adjusted sails, and secured the crossing. The glory belonged to the pharaoh, but the sweat came from their calloused hands. And despite all the glitter of international expeditions, daily life continued, because in the end, life in Egypt depended not only on distant adventures, but also on the routine of shorter journeys, the duration of which could vary greatly depending on the season and the river conditions. Traveling the Nile was always an experience of uncertainty, a journey that at certain times of the year could be completed in a few hours, at others turned into a long and exhausting journey. Everything depended on the strength of the wind and the river's behavior in each season. For the boatmen, this unpredictability was part of the routine. There was never a guarantee of arrival on time. It was like relying on a bus that only arrives when it decides to show up. During the flood season, for example, the river flowed more strongly and offered greater speed for those traveling north. During the dry season, the water became shallower and heavy boats had to be navigated with extreme caution, which made the journeys slow. The wind in turn could be both an ally and an enemy. If it blew steady southward, the sails filled with life. If it failed, the boatmen had only the strength of the oars. This interplay between wind and current made each trip almost unique. Some boatmen became famous for predicting weather changes based on subtle signs, the movement of clouds, the songs of birds, even the direction in which palm trees swayed. Empirical knowledge passed down from father to son made all the difference. Today, we rely on weather forecasting apps. They relied on the silent reading of nature. Passengers, however, were often frustrated. Anxious merchants wanted to get to the markets quickly. Priests demanded that offerings reach the temple by specific date. But the boatmen knew there was no way to rush the river. This tension is reminiscent of today, when we get irritated by delayed flights or stalled trains. The difference is that in Egypt, there was no control center or official justification. The blame was always on the wind or the water. This variability also shaped the economy. Goods that arrived quickly were sold fresh and at a good price. Delayed shipments could lose value or even spoil. Thus, each voyage was a calculated risk, with everyone dependent on nature. The boatman, in the midst of this, was both a worker and a guardian of other people's destinies. And if travel times already created such instability, imagine when a vessel required dozens of men rowing together. Coordination between them was vital, because without discipline, no boat would move forward. The largest boats on the Nile were veritable wooden giants. To move such a massive structure laden with grain, stones, or important people,
The strength of a single boatman wasn't enough. Dozens of men were needed, rowing in perfect synchrony. The sound of the oars hitting the water created an almost hypnotic rhythm, as if an invisible drum guided each arm. It was a spectacle of coordination and collective effort. Rowing in a group required discipline. There was no room for vanity or individual haste. If one man broke the rhythm, the entire boat lost stability and risked running aground. Therefore, the boatmen learned to listen to each other, to trust their companions' movement. It was like playing in an orchestra. Each instrument is beautiful on its own, but true power comes in harmony. The heat of the sun made the work even harder. Sweaty men, tense muscles, and concentrated faces, all united by a common goal: to move the boat forward. At times the fatigue was so great that only the voice of the master boatman shouting orders kept the crew energized. Today we can compare this scene to a sports relay team, or even to workers on a large construction site, where each person must do their part to make the whole work. This collective effort also created bonds. Rowing together day after day generated camaraderie, shared stories, even jokes to ease the tension. Many of these men knew they would never be remembered in official records, but they found pride in the strength of the group. After all, without them, the temples would not have been built, and the markets would not have been supplied. They were essential anonymous individuals, but there were also risks. Extreme exertion could cause injuries, and it was not uncommon for men to faint in the sun or collapse exhausted inside the boat. In these situations, shipmates needed to act quickly, because every life was precious to maintain the vessel's pace. This sense of collective responsibility made the boatmen not just workers, but fellow travelers, and within this cycle of effort and learning, many young people ended up following in their parents' footsteps.
Knowledge and practice were passed down from generation to generation, transforming navigation into an inherited craft as natural as breathing. In ancient Egypt, being a boatman wasn't just a job choice, it was often an inherited destiny. Children grew up watching their parents on the river, learning from an early age how to tie ropes, control oars, and read the wind. Even before they were strong enough to row, they already carried within them the secrets of navigation. It was a silent apprenticeship, passed down not in schools, but on the banks of the Nile. Mornings were improvised schools. While the men adjusted boats, the boys ran around imitating gestures and asking questions. Gradually, they were invited to help with small tasks, holding a rope, carrying a basket, observing a maneuver. This interaction allowed knowledge to be absorbed naturally, almost like learning to speak or walk. The craft was part of the family's blood. This learning also shaped character. Young people learned that sailing required not just strength, but patience, discipline, and observation. They discovered that the river could not be dominated by force, but respected. Many parents used the Nile itself as a metaphor. If you don't respect the water, it will swallow you. It was more than a professional lesson. It was a life lesson, repeated generation after generation. Over time, sons took over from their fathers, and the cycle began again. It was common for the same family of boatmen to be recognized in the village for decades as experts in that art. The surname carried weight, and the reputation was built with each successful voyage. Today, we might think of families of doctors, artisans, or farmers passing their profession down from generation to generation. In Egypt, this happened on the water. Interestingly, as they inherited the craft, they also inherited stories. The young men heard tales of long expeditions, risky voyages, and torch-lit nights. These stories fueled not only their skill but also their pride in belonging to a lineage of navigators. Each boat that sailed the Nile carried, along with its merchandise, the memories of generations, and even though they were respected as masters of navigation, boatmen didn't enjoy high social prestige. They were indispensable workers,
but still viewed as simple by the elite. This contradiction shows how, despite their importance, they occupied a discrete position within Egyptian society. The boatmen, despite being essential to the functioning of Egypt, rarely received public recognition. They were seen as men of the people, ordinary workers who performed a necessary but unprestigious function. The pharaoh was exalted, the priests revered, the scribes respected, and the boatmen, they simply performed their duties, silently, without statues or ceremonies. It was as if they were invisible cogs in a grandiose machine. In the villages, however, the outlook was different. There they were valued for the direct service they provided to the community. A boatman known for his skill in safely transporting cargo or people was respected locally, even if he was never mentioned in official records. This distinction shows how social prestige doesn't always reflect the true importance of a job. How many professions today don't experience the same? Nurses, street cleaners, drivers, essential but rarely celebrated. This contrast could generate ambiguous feelings. On the one hand, there was pride in the craft, in the dominion over the river. On the other, there was also the awareness of occupying a modest position with no chance of social advancement. Many boatmen accepted this as a natural part of life, as if their destiny had been traced by the Nile itself. Resignation was, in a sense, a form of wisdom, but make no mistake, the lack of prestige did not diminish the true value of work. Without boatmen, temples would be without offerings, cities without food, and construction sites without materials. Egypt depended on them as much as it did on scribes and priests. The problem is that recognition was lost in the grandiose speeches of the elite, who preferred to exalt pharaohs and gods. It was like today, when technology receives applause but we forget the workers who keep it running. This social invisibility was also reflected in art. Boatmen were rarely depicted in prominent positions. When they did appear, it was always in scenes of work, without ornamentation, without glory. They were remembered only for what they did, not for what they represent. Yet they continued to row, to carry, to steer, because they knew their role sustained everyone's lives. And this silent dedication, though little recognized, was crucial to the empire's prosperity. After all, it was the boatmen who enabled the circulation of wealth, consolidating the Egyptian economy. The Nile was the route, but they were the ones who made it accessible. The ancient Egyptian economy would not have existed without the Nile, but the river alone was no miracle worker. It was the work of the boatmen that transformed its waters into a network for the circulation of wealth. They carried grain from plantations to urban markets, transported linen to be traded at large fairs, and carried stones destined for monumental construction. Each oar stroke was, in effect, a cog in the machine that kept the empire running. This constant circulation allowed goods not to be restricted to one region. What was produced in the south could feed the north. What arrived via the Mediterranean could be distributed throughout the interior. It was an interconnected economic system, sustained by the skill of these anonymous workers. It's curious to think that without them, the wealth accumulated by the pharaohs would have had no material basis for its existence. Political power depended directly on the efficiency of the boatmen. For merchants, boatmen were indispensable partners. Hiring a good driver meant reducing risks, saving time, and ensuring a real profit. For peasants, it was a chance to see the fruits of their labor reaching other lands. Thus, boatmen not only transported wealth, but also distributed hope and opportunities. They were, in a sense, mediators of prosperity. This decisive role, however, was rarely remembered. In official records, the pharaohs were seen as responsible for the empire's growth, and the river was extolled as a divine gift. But behind the scenes, it was the boatmen who kept the flow going. It's like today, we talk about the large companies that drive the economy, but we rarely remember the truck drivers who make the logistics happen. Invisible, but essential. Beyond the practical aspect, There was also a symbolic dimension. The constant movement of the boats gave the people the feeling that Egypt never stood still. There was always something coming in, something going out, an endless cycle of exchange and abundance. This economic dynamism cemented the idea of a prosperous, strong empire, blessed by the Nile and sustained by human effort. And when we look back, we realize that without this flow, Egypt would never have achieved such grandeur. The riches accumulated in the temples, the treasures buried with the pharaohs, the markets brimming with goods. All of this was only possible thanks to the work of the boatmen, and it is at this point that we reach an inescapable conclusion. Without them, the very unity of Egypt would not have existed. Egypt was vast, divided into regions, local cultures, and seemingly insurmountable distances. But there was an invisible thread that tied it all together: the Nile boatmen. Without them, each village would have lived in isolation. Each temple would have been supplied only by what was within reach of the land, and the cities would never have experienced the dynamism of trade. They were the link that transformed a collection of settlements into an empire. The grandeur we admire today, soaring pyramids, sumptuous temples, teeming markets, only existed because someone wrote. Stone blocks didn't fly to construction sites on their own. Grain didn't multiply in temple storerooms. Offerings didn't reach altars without human effort. Every detail of Egyptian glory rests silently in the hands of the boat.
They don't appear in statues, but they are engraved in the foundation of civilization. This unity created by the river and the men who dominated it was also political. The pharaoh, so exalted as lord of the two lands, was only truly able to unite Upper and Lower Egypt because the Nile served as a bridge. But the river alone was not enough. It needed someone to cross it. Thus, each boatman, transporting goods or people, was also an agent of unification. It was power built in practice, stroke by stroke. It's curious how, in history, the great names remain forever, but it's the anonymous who truly move empires. The pharaoh appeared as the center of everything, but those who sustained the machine were simple workers. The boatmen, invisible to the eyes of the elite, were indispensable in making Egypt the power it so marked in antiquity. Without them, perhaps today, we would speak of a fragmented Egypt, lacking the same brilliance. Their legacy lies in what remained. Every monument, every mural, every myth was one possible because someone steered a boat across the waters of the Nile. It's a reminder that great stories are not made solely by leaders, but by hands working in silence. This is true greatness, the sum of invisible efforts that together sustain eternity. And when we think about all this, we can't help but realize how much the boatman's story still resonates in our lives today. They teach us about resilience, humility, and the strength of invisible connection. But before diving into this final reflection, it's time to open up a special space, the introduction that will invite the viewer to embark on this journey with us. Now that you've sailed with me along the waters of the Nile, you've realized that Egypt's grandeur lay not only in its giant stones or its gold-covered pharaohs, but also in the silent efforts of its boatmen, who, stroke after stroke, built a civilization. And I ask you, in your life, who are the invisible boatmen you might not be seeing? Could it be that you yourself are failing to recognize the value of small actions that underpin great achievement? Think about it. How many times have you blamed yourself for not achieving something great without realizing that it's constant, almost repetitive effort that gets you where you need to be? Maybe it's time to change that perspective. What areas of your life need more patience? Where do you lack discipline to let the current work in your favor? If this reflection resonated with you, I want to challenge you. Don't let this story get lost. like so many others, apply what you've learned here. Recognize the importance of your own boatmen, whether they're people, habits, or routines, and see how this can transform the course of your life. And of course, if you want to continue discovering profound stories full of hidden lessons, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. That way, you won't miss any content and can continue embarking with me on these journeys through time. Now tell me in the comments, what was the biggest lesson you learned from this story?